The program will now begin. Okay. Carla, over to you.
Greetings. My name is Carla Koppell. I'm with the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, which is part of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. It's my great pleasure to be facilitating this conversation with a tremendous group of experts who are all working their way through unprecedented times. We have some 250 participants joining us from around the world, including Argentina, Belgium, Finland, Hungary, Lebanon, Morocco, Kosovo, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Nigeria, and of course the United States. And it's wonderful to be able to reach and speak with such an incredible global audience. Let me mention before we get started on the substance, a couple of notes about the program, which will last approximately 1 hour. As a reminder, you'll have an opportunity to provide questions for panelists to answer. And what you should do is submit your questions using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the webinar. And in your submission, please give your name and your organization. And if you're directing the question to a specific individual, tell us who that individual is. We also had a number of questions submitted in advance. And so we will be drawing both from the questions that were submitted in advance and those you will submit as the discussion progresses. This conversation really is part of work we've been doing for over 2 years on how to ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion in education. We have a council of deans who are focused on these issues from across the United States, of which 2 of our panelists are a member. We've developed and pilot tested a number of courses and modules to try and increase the focus on equity and inclusion issues in educational systems, particularly graduate and undergraduate education. And we're developing a forthcoming edited volume on diversity and inclusion in conflict resolution and development, all in an effort to drive home the focus on these issues in our educational system. So why did we organize this event? Well, we organized this event because we're in the midst of an unprecedented global pandemic that is putting to the test a lot of the assumptions we've made about education and are really stretching us to think about how we continue to deliver for everybody, for all students and members of university communities in a time when we are forced to distance from one another, to use technology that not everybody has access to, and to really build bridges where we haven't been forced to build bridges in the past. I'm thrilled that we're able to have this conversation because I think it is incredibly important, both to reflect back on the lessons we can learn from the last several months of work to bring these communities together in new and different ways, and to reflect towards the future and to think creatively about how we ensure equity and inclusion in the months ahead, and how we use this opportunity to strengthen our ability to educate everyone globally. With that, I want to start the conversation with our panelists, and we thought it was particularly important to get a view from the students themselves as we begin a conversation about how to better serve students. And so I'm thrilled to be able to bring to you Anna Liu, who was born and raised in Texas, but is a second-year graduate student in security studies, getting her master's degree from the School of Foreign Service in Washington, D.C. She's also vice president of the Security Studies Program Student Council. She's a Security Studies Program admissions ambassador and associate editor of the Georgetown Security Studies Review. She's also been active in trying to work here at Georgetown to ensure that we're meeting the needs of students, and we want you to frame the conversation a bit for us as we kick off the discussion. So Anna, please give us your perspective.
Thank you so much, Carla. So as a student representative and a soon-to-be alumni at Georgetown, I just wanted to highlight a few of the challenges and frame some of the issues I have seen a lot of classmates experiencing, and hopefully shed some light on what may be impacting students around the country right now. And so they're essentially broken down into 3 categories. The first is accommodating and alleviating students' personal impacts. And so this might be financial and or personal for students. These would be a lot of graduate students asking for tuition reduction, in summer classes. And that's one of the petitions that we have, as a student representative, been a part of working towards at Georgetown, trying to help students kind of relieve some of this financial burden. And a lot of it will also be stress and mental health that is the productivity of students. A lot of students are facing relocation. Some of them are sick. Some of them do have or have been dealing with COVID or their family members being sick. Some students are leaving communities that they've built up for years. And some of them have family environments. A lot of graduate students as well have children at home, and trying to do school and test and write papers at home is a big challenge. And the second issue category is the virtual class environment itself. So a lot of times it's just difficult to engage with students screen to screen, and the physical environment of what that looks like is a challenge. And so sometimes that results in technical difficulties, like professors having issues using Zoom or Wi-Fi problems. And so a lot of that can potentially be mitigated with preparation and just bearing with each other in this time of giving grace. And so that's the virtual class environment itself that might be difficult. Some professors have even chosen not to have class altogether and just do Canvas or Blackboard discussions and emails. And so that was something that has been an issue during this transition time as well. And then in the third category are the postgraduate resources. So I'm graduating as well. And so finding a job in networking has become a whole different monster being virtual. And I think a lot of students are struggling to find more resources and connect with alumni and employers since they can't do it in person, they can't attend events, they can't attend some of these networking opportunities. And so these main three categories are a lot of what I've heard that are on the minds of a lot of my classmates. And so I know that right now a lot is uncertain, and I do think that schools can and should care for their students now more than ever during this time. And I know over the course of the semester, I myself struggled often to find motivation to write a paper or complete an assignment because of what was going on outside of school. And my university's flexibility really helped alleviate that stress and worry, and preparing for the uncertain future with the students' best interest in mind can make the biggest difference moving forward. So I thank you all for being here and engaging in this discussion today.
Thank you so much. I couldn't have asked for a better, crisper encapsulation of the range of issues that are affecting students. It's fantastic to have you frame the initial discussion for us, and many, many congratulations. And we know that you'll have a bright future ahead of you, notwithstanding the challenging times right now. So thanks so much, Anna. I'm going to turn to introduce our discussants now. I want to make two just little notes to the group. We have some folks hearing an echo, so one thing I'm going to be doing is turning my video on and off, and others can just make sure they're muting and turning video on and off to help everybody have a strong signal. And then the second thing I would say is that there was a question about it being recorded, and yes, we're recording. So rest assured that will be there to promulgate further. So without further ado, I want to turn, and I'm going to introduce our three discussants for the duration of our conversation. And then I'm going to turn to them with 2 rounds of questions, and I'll explain that in a second. But first, Dean Laura Bloomberg has served as the Dean of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota since 2017. She's also a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, and she's the board chair of the Nationwide Public Policy and International Affairs Program, as well as serving on the boards of a number of other distinguished institutions. She's further a member of the University Leadership Council on Diversity, Inclusion, and International Affairs and Public Policy Education, which I mentioned earlier. Laura, thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Rita Kiki Edozie is a professor and associate dean at the McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies and a professor of African International Relations for the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Previously, she was also a professor of international relations and African affairs at James Madison College of Public Affairs and Michigan State University, as well as having served as deputy director of the Institute of African Studies at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. She as well is a member of our University Leadership Council. Welcome, Kiki. And Professor Jim Goldgeier is a former dean at the School of International Service at American University and the Robert Bosch Senior Visiting Fellow for the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. While he was dean at AU, he created the School of International Services Advisory Council on Diversity and Inclusion and established an Exploring Identities series, which was designed to foster greater inclusivity in the field of international affairs. He's also worked and taught political science and international affairs at Cornell and George Washington University, and was a past president of the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs. Thank you, Jim, for joining us. So as we kick off the conversation with all of you, I want to first have us look backwards a bit. We were all forced extremely quickly to transfer to online education, to have students move home or off campus, at least in large measure, in response to the rapid spread of this pandemic. And some things went more smoothly and more successfully than others. Anna's comments are indicative of the kinds of challenges that students around the world have been facing and coping with, and academic administrators and instructors have been coping with. I wonder if you could each in turn, and we'll first go to Laura and then to Kiki and then to Jim, comment a little bit looking back on what you think worked and what were challenges that were either unanticipated or that left gaps, that retrospective view. So Laura, please go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you so much, Carla, for the invitation. And it's really an honor to be on a panel with some really esteemed colleagues across the country. And I'm so delighted to hear that there are so many countries represented on this call, because we know this is a global issue that we're dealing with. And although there are so many tragedies happening, there is also this opportunity to remind ourselves that in many ways we have so much in common. And right now, I think we need to be thinking really strategically about that. So looking back, I want to just highlight a couple of things. There's so much to say. But first of all, I would like to situate this as we talk about higher ed in the reality that higher education has a reputation for being a little lumbering and slow, a little bureaucratic, a little tradition and rule bound. And I just got to say that despite all of the missteps and the problems, an entire sector of society pivoted with amazing speed to do something that no one would have thought possible. And I give higher ed broadly a lot of credit for the work that happened, even as we start to parse the problems. It makes me think about the Eleanor Roosevelt line that she had said on the floor of the United Nations, I believe is where she said it the first time, although somebody is bound to correct me, where she said, "You must do the thing you think you cannot do." Well, I believe higher ed has done the thing we all thought we could not do. And along the way, there are some things that I think I learned as a leader, and I think we learned collectively. One is that the pre-existing conditions and circumstances that people brought into this pandemic are multiple and intersectional. So I think that our student, Anna, did a great job of highlighting the challenges that students face. And we do have situations like first generation college attenders who are also parents, who also have food insecurity and are fragilely housed. All of those things together add to the fact that they may have a learning disability or a hearing impairment that impacts our ability to study online, and all of those things impact us. So understanding the intersectionality of that. Now I'm going to say something about that may not be universally popular, but in many situations it is true that institutions of higher education are also a substantial employer. And I do not think that we can ignore that reality as we think about meeting the needs of all of our stakeholder groups. that our food service, our residential halls, our maintenance staff are people oftentimes who lack undergraduate degrees, who are low income earners, who are also parents and caregivers and themselves fragilely employed at times when we think about a drop off in students. So there's some intersectionality too as we think about equity and inclusion, that of course students are our major stakeholder group. The reality is they are not our only stakeholder group when we think about what a university provides for a community and society. The other thing I want to just touch on as I think about looking back is the question of empathy. For me as a leader, for any of us working with large groups of people in higher education, and what does empathy look like as we think about equity and inclusion in a time of crisis? Because I think that we can run the risk of empathy starting to look like it's all about the leader who's conveying it. I feel so bad. I am so sorry. I am hurting because you're hurting is not as helpful as thinking about what does empathy and action look like, so that we can take on board the real needs that people have, reflect that we see it, we acknowledge the harm, the pain, the suffering, and we move towards how collectively do we address it, as opposed to sticking with only recognizing it. So those are some of the things, broadly speaking, that I've been thinking about looking back.
Thanks so much, Laura. I think that's a great encapsulation. And I think that idea that there are the concrete things you need to provide everyone in your university community, and then there are the intangibles that matter as much as the tangible ones, is a really interesting and important point. Kiki, your reflections?
Opportunity to share these critical experiences that I personally have been experiencing, let alone our university, with the world. So thank you for organizing a critical session. I just want to present, perhaps, in thinking back, when Carla asked me this question, I began to think about the first time that our university collectively experienced questions of equity and inclusion and the COVID-19 pandemic. UMass Boston is a majority minority university in terms of its student base. And so when we speak about ensuring equity and inclusion around this pandemic, we're speaking about most of our students. So we were a public university here in Boston. We were, I think, the first, we had the first diagnosed case of COVID in the state of Massachusetts, and we had the 4th case in the world. And it was on our campus. It was late January. It was a time when nobody knew much about this pandemic. It hadn't been, the World Health Organization had not attributed pandemic status to it. So, there were lots of conversations about it, but nobody really knew what was going on. But we're a multicultural educational model campus. We have, 62% of non-white population, and that population is diverse. We're the 3rd most diverse campus in the country. However, we do have a lot of international students, and we were just about to begin the semester, the spring semester, and we got an announcement that we had in late January a positive diagnosis of COVID-19. But I think that our administration handled it so well that it was business as usual. I remember the several meetings that we had trying to articulate and model the social distancing, the treatment, the way that we, handle, this case. And I just remember the mobilization of resources and sentiment and morale and solidarity around the case by faculty, students. So it was wonderful. We all of a sudden, in early February, began to see many of our students wearing masks. And we began to sort of articulate quite early issues of this pandemic. However, we had a big challenge. And the big challenge was battling anti-Chinese racism on campus. And I'm so proud of our Chancellor's statement. And this was early February when she set the model. I'd just like to read an extract from her statement. I would like to take a moment to dwell on the importance of remembering our mission and our values at a time like this. We have a diverse city and region and are proud and welcome students and faculty and staff from all corners of the globe. We are unlike any other public university in New England. We extend ourselves and celebrate people of varied races, ethnicities, and ages and economic backgrounds, and are proud of that record. So I want us to exercise tolerance. What had happened was that there had been a spike in anti-Chinese racism on campus around COVID, and the Chancellor and the administration felt the need to mobilize, a consciousness and a climate that was inclusive. And this was early February. And so what went well was the fact that we handled the crisis early. I don't think we had another case, and this was early February when we had our first case, and we never had another case until we left. Spring break was mid-March. But the challenge is, of course, in that it began to stoke a lot of misunderstanding on a diverse campus, of lots of misunderstandings about identity and around this topic. And so, I just think that, these were the challenges. Another challenge, just very quickly, of course, is that when COVID began to express the data of health disparities and disproportionate deaths, as well as contagion of COVID among minorities, especially in Boston. 42% of the positive cases were among minorities and Black populations. And we express, as a public university, a city university, express a lot of that population. So that also began to raise questions about how we would handle disparities. Again, our faculty and students already began to organize research groups with the mayor of Boston and with partner schools around COVID and health disparities, and especially about immigration. So that's what I want to share for now. I think there's a lot of tragedy, there's a lot of, honestly, pain that a lot of us are going through, but there's also a lot of opportunity and innovation and collaboration, and that's where I see the future.
Great, thank you, Kiki. I think it's really an important observation about how you need to pivot also to deal with the need to bring a community together and not allow a crisis to lead to polarization. So thanks for those observations. Jim.
Great, well, thanks for having me. Great to be here with two people, three, counting you, Carla, who are deeply engaged in this right now. And I wanted to just, on this first section, just talk about Anna's first point about accommodating personal impacts, because I think, there are a lot of things that universities did well. I certainly, as I talked to faculty and sort of watched what was going on around the country, it seemed like most professors were forgiving of the range of circumstances that students were finding themselves in and trying to be, as helpful as they could be. And it seemed that universities were also being flexible, for example, on creating pass-fail options. But, it was interesting the debates that arose over that. Some schools were making it all pass-fail, and in other cases, students could choose. And there were questions raised about the the equity issues involved. Students who were having an easier time of it could still go forward with getting grades, and others, might need to choose the pass-fail option. And while that might seem like, well, that's really helping to accommodate personal impacts, there were equity questions that were raised on that. With respect to things not going so well, I would just put it in the way of really, it's really important to be thinking about, do we have processes on our campus that made sense before this, but that seem unnecessarily rigid today? And an example I would use comes from a student that I know of who was dealing with a very difficult situation. And, I think in our campus, like many others, if students want to take an incomplete for the semester and finish the work later, they're only eligible to do so if they have gotten a certain amount of work done for that class. In this case, the student, had gone back home. His parents were then out of work. They weren't eligible for the stimulus check due to their immigration status. He was needed to find full-time work to try to support the family. My thought was, well, oh my gosh, you should just take it incomplete. And, the university said, well, no, he's not eligible to take it incomplete. And I think there we really need to think about, okay, well, why do we have that policy? And even if it did make sense before, does it still make sense today? We can't assume we have any idea what's going on in our students' lives. And I would say the same thing is also true for our faculty who were thrown into this without warning. I think, as Laura was saying, I think they really rose to the occasion, as did the students. We don't normally see into the home lives of our faculty, but a number of them, they've been slammed with childcare, with elder care, with spouses losing jobs. And, for this spring, their schedules were set before this pandemic hit. And all of a sudden, they had responsibilities for class in a totally different situation. And I think that that was incredibly challenging for a number of faculty, and really need to think about how to address that as we go forward.
Thanks so much, Jim. I think I have 2 university-age children, and it was interesting to observe various universities and how they adapted. And I think that there were a lot of people who were very surprised at the disparities in situation and the multiplicity of different needs and how to respond to all of those needs. So pointing out this kind of an example is really helpful because it gives a granular sense of the sort of textures of different people's lives and how they intersect with the university community. So I'm going to turn to the second question now. And this question is really about looking forward. So as we look to the future, and we know we don't exactly know what the future holds, how the different campuses are going to be operating, what they need to be doing. If we were consultants to the universities of the world, and we were thinking about these issues of equity and inclusion, what would we say are the opportunities for improvement, and how do we make sure that we use those not just to serve the students of today increasingly well, but also to broaden the people that we're able to reach and able to serve. And I'm going to go in the same order again. So I'll go Laura, then Kiki, and then Jim. And while we got many, many questions from folks before the event, please feel free to use the Q&A function to send in questions as they occur to you listening to the speakers. So with that, Laura, please go ahead and reflect on the future.
In 30 seconds or less, right? No, I do want to be
We'll give you 45.
Oh, great. I know there are a lot of questions, and I'm eager to hear what they are. And thinking about the future is a vast thing. But let me just touch on a couple of things that I've been pondering a lot. First of all, I really am drawn to something that Jim said about our rigid structures, and Kiki talked about. We have this opportunity in the midst of tragedy. We have this opportunity to think about building partnerships in different ways. I think we have a vast opportunity to think about connections and dropping rigid structures in ways that create a lot of synergy. And I'm excited about that. I think, for instance, that we can no longer talk about pipelines. That's a term that I don't particularly love because it implies, students come in one end and get shot out the other with whatever, a degree or a certificate. I think we need to really think more broadly and flexibly about pathways into, out of, and through our programs in ways that make sense for students and their lives. So that's an area where I think it's just ripe for us to rethink some rigid boundaries and some structures in higher ed generally in a way that is more equitable and accessible to people with the greatest level of barriers to our traditional systems. I also, a little closer to the pandemic, think, and this is a hard one, but I've been thinking about it a lot. I started by talking about empathy, and empathy is important. The reality is that the longer this pandemic goes on before we have a vaccination, we are going to be personally touched, all of us in our lives, by the pandemic. And we know that people who have underlying health conditions, who have, for all kinds of cultural reasons, had poorer access to healthcare, there's a lot of people who, by virtue of their demographics, are more vulnerable. What does grieving and support look like in higher education? That's not something we talk about typically, but I believe it's something that will face us. And for me, it was just last week that I think we've all got stories of people we know who have died of COVID. For me personally, it was last week when a colleague who's only a few years older than I am was a marathon runner and a very active STEM alliance person focused on girls and people of color in math and sciences, died very suddenly. And we as a community were sort of faced with, well, how do we talk about this? How do we grieve? How do we do that? And so I think that that's something that's going to be very real in our very near future. And then the last thing I would say, which is a complex thing, but something that I urge us all to think about, is thinking carefully about timing. So Carla, you just mentioned we don't yet know what the fall will look like for teaching, for instance. I think we all have to get comfortable with the fact that ambiguity and urgency can be uncoupled. Some things are just going to be ambiguous longer than other things. And by getting comfortable with that, I believe we'll make better decisions that are more supportive of students if we don't move too quickly. And then there are other things that are urgent and life-threatening, and there is no time to think about shared governance or shared decision. There's a decision that needs to be made today. And we have to become really good at diagnosing those two different kinds of ways of thinking about timing. So those are things I think about for the future. A little more than 45 seconds, sorry.
No, those are great points. And I remember talking with a student at Georgetown who was saying that just the idea that assignments became due when you got them done, that is, there was that flexibility, was an enormous release valve that she received from one of her instructors. So I think your points are really well taken. Kiki, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, hi again. So just very quickly, I think there's a new buzzword on campus. It's called academic continuity planning. And so most campuses, including my own, are setting up academic continuity planning committees, cross-campus committees. And what this is about, it's about focusing on mitigating risk and reducing potential damage during this crisis. We don't know what the summer will look like. We at UMass Boston don't know what the fall will look like, but we are creating these planning, sessions to begin to sort of talk about, and provide ideas on how to handle this. I would say, and I have been advocating that these continuity planning committees be inclusive and widely representative. This is sometimes lost. I think we need to continue to advocate for students with fewer resources, which is most of our students at UMass Boston. Many of our students are working class and are essential workers. That's why perhaps our students petitioned not to have a virtual graduation. We couldn't understand it. We said, we're going to be innovative, we're going to be virtual. We came up with these ideas. They said no. 80% of them said no. They would prefer a postponed in-person ceremony whenever we get back. So I'd also like us to, we're all paying lots of attention to how to adopt engaged teaching pedagogies, online, right? I mean, we're trying to teach online in the first place, but how do we be engaged in teaching online? And something that I'm reminding our faculties and students is about how to apply culturally responsive teaching strategies online. And so I know that's a lot for everyone, but I impress upon our faculty about the digital divide, how many of our students, now that we have gone remote and online, are having the most difficulty. And also, just simply acknowledging diverse perspectives, experiences, and approaches to learning. This is the opportunity that we have to do that. So we're mobilizing at UMass Boston around a number of models, the community models, where we're now sort of impressing upon storytelling, no matter what the subject is, bringing in the personal stories of our students who are suffering, but also engaging our own stories. We are trying to have more social presence, even though it's online, and teaching presence. So we're experimenting with a number of just innovative designs around online teaching that, we never knew, were out there. But, these are great opportunities to be more inclusive and diverse. And finally, I'm just really proud of a lot of our faculty and, grad students who are engaged in public policy research around COVID-19. Already, we have produced, a number of really interesting mini research pieces and articles by our faculty. I just want to name one, for example, by one of our aging policy faculties. She's looking at, the title of her piece is "Older People Are Part of the Solution." And this is coming out of the fact that 50% of our deaths in COVID-19 are in nursing homes and elder care homes. And now we've got, faculty who are dived right in to that kind of research. So, I think the future is hopeful, even though it's a new normal to communicate and relay and express ideas this way. I think the future is hopeful because we are being innovative, and we are, sort of not just adapting to change, but jumping right ahead and driving change. All right.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Kiki. That's super interesting. And I know that I think it was a couple of things you commented on are so important. I mean, that idea that you were pulling students in to poll them and find out their views and try to pivot and react to how they were feeling. And I know that because you do have a low-income population, you ended up distributing laptops as well to ensure greater connectivity. So it's interesting to see how people need to meet their school population where the population lives. Jim.
Right, well, I think it's important to remember that for universities in recent years, diversity has been easier for them to achieve than equity and inclusion. They can change the way they think about how they're going to try to put together a cohort of students, or change the way they think about hiring staff and faculty. But then you bring these diverse populations to campus, and they haven't always been supported in the way they need to be. So I think we need to keep that in mind. You know, Anna's second point, and she'll notice that I'm avoiding her third point about postgraduate outcomes, but her second point on the virtual class environment itself, really important to understand just how much training faculty really are going to need and just how much higher the demands are going to be on faculty going forward. You know, we're used at this time of the year, we're used to faculty finishing up, turning their grades in, and, you know, at research universities, they think to themselves, great, I'm going to go off for the summer and do my research, and I'll show up again, you know, in the fall semester and teach my class that I've taught before. And that's not what this is going to be. This is going to be really needing to rethink. I know, you know, what we did this spring was we moved on-campus classes to a remote learning environment. I taught 2 years ago in our online graduate degree program. I had months of training, you know, thinking about the kind of materials to put together, thinking about how to teach in that environment. It's not just doing what you'd normally do and then doing it in a different format. All the universities are talking about hybrid. They're all talking about they're going to have some on campus, they're going to have some online, they haven't figured it out, it might be rotating, may differ between undergrad and grad. I am very concerned about how this is actually going to work. You know, I applaud people for thinking creatively, but you know, we'll have students with no accessibility issues and, you know, who can come to campus without much trouble. We'll have others for whom, you know, underlying health conditions mean that, you know, they can't really do that. And they really do need to stay distant. We have talked a lot in recent years about accommodations on campus. I don't recall discussions of underlying health conditions as one of those, unless it was sort of folks who, you know, might not be able to teach in a particular building because of, or take classes in a particular building. But, you know, we've done, you know, accessible buildings, and we've had classes that are more accessible. But I think, you know, we really need to expand our understanding of what it means to provide accommodations. And that includes, for example, when I hear university leaders talk about, yes, we understand there may be waves of the virus, and so, you know, we may need to bring people on and off campus. Well, okay, if you've got somebody who's coming in from out of state who doesn't have a lot of resources, how is that person going to be flying back and forth to your campus? They're not going to be able to go back and forth. They're going to be in one place, or they're going to be in another place. So I think just anytime we talk about these issues, we have to think about, you know, how many of our students can actually do the things that we're thinking about, and what do we need to do to support the ones who are not going to be able to do the things that we're talking about.
Great, that's super helpful. And I think touching on these different populations and how they're affected and how that works both with the way we respond in campus communities and how we respond and pivot our research is tremendously important and interesting. We're going to turn to questions now for all of you, and we have, let me say, more questions than we could ever table in the intervening 15 minutes we've got about available for us to have a conversation. So I'll start in, but I apologize to those in advance who have sent in questions that we won't get to. And if folks can, if each of the speakers could keep their answers brief, then that will enable us to get through more questions. So I'll start with the basics. This is from Angaragiola Bernier, and I don't know the proper pronunciation because I'm not sure where you are, but asking, talk a bit about how you ensure equitable access to basic needs at the school. How many students are experiencing food or housing insecurity in the United States? How many have unmet health needs because they're not on campus with health services anymore? Could be psychological and mental health services in addition to physical. I know some people had jobs that were supporting their whole family, not just themselves. So if particularly Laura and Kiki, you could speak, and Jim, to the extent you want to comment on AU, where you're still teaching, I know, but those basic needs, how are you providing for those, and do you see unmet needs? And maybe we'll, Laura, turn to you. I know we talked about this a little bit yesterday.
Sure. Yes, we did. This is huge. And I think that there are a lot of complexities here. we have data privacy guidelines that I think are important to keep. We have to blur the boundaries a little bit at times, but I'm not sure, for instance, everybody needs to know everybody's underlying health conditions, yet we need to know enough so that we can support people. So that's a delicate boundary. I also think that the thing we talked about yesterday that I'll mention here is the issue of emergency funds. I think those have come up, or an emergency fund to meet real-time needs for students. That issue has come up in a lot of institutions. And for us at the Humphrey School, I didn't win a lot of popularity contests when I said this, but I said I don't think that is the best thing for us to be doing right now. I believe an emergency fund to support students is essential. For the university itself, or for the Humphrey School to stand it up, becomes very complex, because every time we issue a check or some remuneration to a student, it impacts their financial aid. And that's an unintended consequence we wouldn't have wanted. So we worked pretty strategically, legally, I might add, but strategically, to channel funds to a student organization that operated as a separate entity. It was not, so the bottom line is they have their own financial audit. They're not subject to the financial constraints of the university. And any one of us as administrators, as students, as faculty, can make donations to that emergency fund that is run by and for students. One way of looking at that is the administration doesn't care. Another way of looking at it is that we need to build strong alliances to efficiently and effectively get the support to the people who need it. In that instance, it's working really well. And as a school, we can turn our attention to providing financial support for as many possible students who will be interning this summer as we can. We've, I think, tripled the amount of funds we have available for student stipends for unpaid internships. We're doing that because we're not funding an emergency fund. We're leaving that to happen outside of the school. So that's just one strategy.
Great, thanks. Kiki? Demute.
One is two examples. One story that you mentioned, Carla, is how we mobilized resources around, fundraising for Chrome computers for our students. So we went into shelter in place just after spring break. So we had a week of spring break to get ready for it. And we were celebrating the fact that, all of our faculty, actually, we had 100%, transition to online or remote learning. But then we discovered that 60% of our students said that they did not have access to, a laptop or a computer. They couldn't do this. So we had to quickly fundraise to provide loaner computers to them. So we did a crowdfund and we were able to mobilize those funds within 2 weeks, and we got Chrome loaners to all of those students. 60% that said they didn't have access, they now had access. And sometimes we even paid for internet services for those students. More recently, we have received the relief funding through the CARES Act, and we have received a quite considerable amount of money for students, though. It's for students who are undergoing emergency relief needs related to COVID-19. And so our question was, how do we distribute this money? How do we get this money to the students quickly when they need it? And so a lot of communication processes. We had to set up web page communication processes where students could apply for this funding. Of course, that wasn't enough. We had to go through our faculty, our classes, and promote the CARES Act and promote the program. And we found now that within a 2-week period, we have about 80% of our students who have already sort of applied for some kind of COVID-related need. So we are trying to get the resources to our students equitably. It's always a difficult job, but we're doing our best.
Jim, did you want to add anything on this, or should we turn to the next question? Okay, so we'll go to the next question. And I want to combine two questions because I think it's really interesting. You began speaking to this, Kiki, when you were talking about the distribution of laptops, but Margaret Hanson Muse, who's an instructor at the Eisenhower School of National Defense University, and Medea, who doesn't say where she's from, talk about this issue with regard both to students who don't have inadequate online access and access to computer equipment. And then Medea asked with regard to developing countries where the majority of students don't have internet access and live far from the university, and asked about both the concrete things that can be done to help and also what the implicit social justice concerns are in relying on a virtual environment for continuity. And I'm curious if who from among us would like to reflect on that a little bit. Jim.
Yeah, great question. And I think it's a particularly great question because what we are seeing is a sense that, well, we may be able to have some students on campus, but we have international students, and those international students aren't going to be able to get visas, and so they'll need to be online. And there's just this assumption that the international students that we have who won't be able to come here, and this is also true, for example, international affairs schools in other in other places. I mean, in Europe, in Asia, I mean, the percentage of international students at some of these schools is extremely high, much higher than at schools in the United States. And again, the assumption is, well, we're going to have online options, but that doesn't mean those students are actually going to be able to get online. And what those schools can actually do to help strikes me as being pretty limited. But I think being aware of this issue, as opposed to just saying we'll just have them be online until they can get visas, needs to be amended.
I think that's a great point. Laura or Kiki, please go ahead.
Because of my expertise in African affairs, I happened to just 2 weeks ago participate in a panel on the continent by faculty and administrators in the continent at universities there, and how they were coping with COVID-19. And of course, this question was the most critical question. They're all closed down as well, because this is a global pandemic, of course. And how do they reach their students? And they have said that they're using the mobile phone system. Of course, there are challenges with that. Students are actually receiving their lectures through mobile phones. They said they're setting up a lot of, conference calls. Of course, internet technology is not reliable. They're using a little bit of that, but it's just not reliable. Mostly, they're using mobile phone systems, and they say that their students have gone back to all parts of the country, to the rural hinterlands, to those who are remaining in the cities. But they have been able to maintain courses through mobile phone systems. I mean, research has to be done about this. I mean, this is a book waiting to happen, but they say it is happening.
Great, Laura, you had wanted to comment, and I want to squeeze in one more question, so if you guys could be brief, and we can circle back to you, Jim. Go ahead.
I actually was just going to say the same thing that Kiki said. It's amazing how many parts of the world are doing pretty innovative things with WhatsApp and WeChat, and there's opportunity there. There's also the question of timing, and it may be that some people will wait a year before they engage with us, and that may be the best option for them, and we have to create that pathway opportunity as well. That's all I was going to add.
No, I think that's great. And Jim, I'm going to turn to you in a second, but I would add, from my time working at U.S. Agency for International Development, there's a lot of work on how you reach people in difficult locations and provide education. And we in the United States probably need to take a lot of pages from some of the development assistance books in how we begin to reach international students without having them need to fly to the U.S. Jim.
Yeah, I just gonna, on the phone thing, I mean, it's a great point. The online program that we have, primarily students come in through their phone. And I know when I taught in it, had students in there from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and it does make a difference. But I think, you know, there was also an app that was developed by the company that we work with for mobile students using their phone as opposed to their computer. And I think universities need to be thinking about that as well.
Great. And I did want to just pick up on two other points. I think, Kiki, your point about the CARES Act, and this may be the CARES Act in the US, but it's assistance to universities around the world, how you use that and making an affirmative choice to close these gaps in equity and inclusion and access is a really great use of those resources, and something that all the universities represented on the line could contemplate as they're thinking about where to put the dollars that they're getting from various countries. We're almost at time, but I really we've been focused mostly on the students and then the choices that academic administrators are making. And Melissa Deering wrote in and she said, you know, she enjoyed the point that both Jim and Laura made about needing to get rid of unnecessarily rigid systems in this time and to be nimble and adapt. And she mentions the challenges that faculty, and particularly female faculty, are facing when they have little kids at home that they're now obligated to take care of and to help continue learning. They are still doing research, they're still teaching. This is true of men and women, but we know from research that women tend to bear the larger share of the caregiving burden in the home. What advice would you have for promotion committees and review committees when you're assessing faculty performance, particularly faculty who are primary caregivers at this time, and how should we be approaching that as this disruption continues and extends?
Well, I will speak to this in the first instance, and then Jim, maybe you can close this out. This is a vexing problem, and I don't have the answer, but I think that we need to make our promotion and tenure committees and our faculty at large aware of a lot of the research that shows these disparities, because awareness, I think, is an eye-opening thing for people who don't really believe there's a problem. So for instance, many of our universities have unilaterally extended the tenure clock, if you will, because of the pandemic. So we just have another year. Our faculty have another year towards tenure. We know from research around parental leaves that the disproportionately benefits men, that men often have more opportunity to engage in research during that extension than women do, for the same reasons that we have disparities in the first place. We need to be aware of it. And when we're aware of it, I think it can start to influence the promotion and tenure discussion, which is very much a shared governance approach to higher education and promotion within the academy, which is why I, as a dean, will stop short of saying what I think we should do about it beyond making sure that people truly know, because you can't unknow something once you are faced with some pretty compelling evidence to the contrary.
Great, and just to note, because it's kind of cool, Melissa is from Qatar University in Doha, and Madio is in Pakistan. So Jim, your thoughts, and then I'm gonna have some closing comments, then we'll.
Yeah, I mean, this issue, because it's not just, as you were pointing out, sort of the disproportionate burden with respect to childcare, but we also know that this is also true with elder care as well. And so a lot of our women faculty are getting hit from both directions. And Laura's point is absolutely correct about what typically happens with respect to the leaves. So I would say one thing, I mean, we should really think about whether or not, even including with our letter request to external evaluators, do we sort of put in these letters, you know, do we allow faculty to talk about what kinds of extra burdens that they faced? Because, you know, the one-year tenure extension is great, but if there's disparities during it, those are just going to increase. And I will close with this gets to my pet peeve in general about the tenure track, which is we ask faculty to put together their tenure files typically after their 5th year and evaluate them in their 6th year. I have always felt like this is way too short. Why are we having a we'll keep you forever or we're going to get rid of you conversation at the end of somebody's 5th year on the faculty? And so I think we should just have people be on the tenure track for much longer, and that will help to, as people have different issues that come up, that will help reduce, I hope, reduce some of these disparities and will also alleviate stress and anxiety.
Great, thanks. Kiki.
Just quickly, I know we want to close, and I agree with Laura and Jim. Those are great suggestions, and those are suggestions that we're implementing at UMass Boston as well. But what's come up now with this sort of teaching online and remote teaching and distant teaching is the difference between synchronous teaching and asynchronous teaching. And what we're recommending for mothers and parents, with multiple tasking in the home is asynchronous teaching, which is all they need to do is onload and onboard or design their courses and offer them to the students at any time. They don't have to be structured into a set sort of format for their classes. And so that's just one little, helpful, I think, policy change that I know that our faculty who are working mothers appreciate.
That's great. I think those are great concrete suggestions. And I have to say, I'm a little bit weepy that I have to close the session because there are so many good questions and there are new good questions coming in, even as we're talking. But what I just want to conclude with, and I see all of you guys. Is there any burning issue you want to close with? Otherwise, I will take us out. Okay. So what I want to conclude with is just, I think that collectively, including those who are on the line, we have an obligation to raise awareness of all these issues and disparities, because I don't think that there is a general awareness of the issues that everybody is facing, the complexity of the challenges that you all are tackling, the number of issues that are being faced. And in fact, Kyra Zimmerman wrote asking about whether there are any platforms around which to coordinate between universities, because it all seems to be quite ad hoc. And I think that's actually a great suggestion to try to brainstorm a way forward and to have the kind of cross-fertilization that we've had this morning or evening, depending on where you are in the world, among this small group of folks. There's much more ground to cover, but I think we can all be helpful in talking about both the challenges and the solutions as we leave this discussion. And so I want to conclude by thanking everybody on the line, for thanking all of our panelists. It was a great, great conversation. Thanking Anna for framing the issues so lucidly for us, and Alexandra Smith and Jessica Keller, who have really facilitated for us on the Institute side and made this a very smooth conversation. So thanks to everybody. I applaud you for joining and for your insightful remarks. And I wish everybody a great rest of the week. Thank you so much. Take care.